They said his place was on the ground, under the punishing Georgia sun. They said the sky, vast and blue and free, belonged to white men. That a boy whose great-grandmother was born in chains had no business dreaming of wings, of soaring above the very world that was designed to keep him pinned down. They said he was just another colored boy from Columbus, destined for a life of hard labor and quiet submission. When he would later summon the courage to try and join his own country's nascent Air Corps, the United States of America would effectively laugh in his face. Yet, across an ocean, in the cockpit of a fragile biplane made of canvas and wood, he would paint a heart with a dagger through it on the side of his fuselage as a declaration of war. And in the bullet-stitched skies over France, he would become a hero to one nation and a ghost to another. German pilots would come to fear him, their reports describing a dark, swift shadow that hunted them from the clouds, a phantom they would name the Black Swallow of Death. And Eugene Bullard, the boy America threw away, would become the world's first black combat fighter pilot. To understand the man who conquered the sky, you must first feel the crushing gravity of the hell he was so desperate to escape. Eugene Jacques Bullard was born in Columbus, Georgia, in 1895. This was not merely the South. This was the deep, brutal, suffocating heart of the Jim Crow era, less than 30 years after the end of the Civil War. It was a world built on a fragile and violently enforced peace, a cage of unspoken rules where a single misplaced glance, a step off the wrong side of the sidewalk, could be a death sentence. The air itself seemed thick, not just with the humidity and the dust of the red Georgia clay, but with the suffocating weight of a hate so pervasive it was like the weather, an accepted, unchangeable part of the landscape. For a young black boy, life was a daily lesson in limitations, a constant soul-crushing education in all the things you could not do, all the places you could not go, all the dreams you were not, under any circumstances, allowed to have. But in the small, weathered home of the Bullard family, a different kind of education was taking place. Eugene's father, William, a man of formidable presence and spirit, known as Big Chief Ox, refused to let his children's souls be confined by the world outside their door. He planted a different, more dangerous seed in his son's mind: the idea of escape. He told his children stories passed down from his own father, stories that defied the narrative of slavery. He told them that their ancestors were not just property, but proud Creek Indians who had been free. And he told them of a place that to a boy in the segregated South sounded as mythical and distant as the moon. A place called France. William Bullard, who had never set foot outside of Georgia, spoke of France as a kind of paradise on earth, a land where a man was judged not by the accident of his birth or the color of his skin, but by the content of his heart. "Down here, son," he would say, his voice a low rumble of weary truth. "A black man ain't a man at all. They can do anything to you, and there's nothing you can do. But over there in France, everyone is treated the same." For young Eugene, this idea became more than a comfort. It became an obsession. France was not a country. It was a concept. It was the physical embodiment of freedom, a promised land where the weight of his skin might finally be lifted. It became his personal North Star, an anthem of possibility in a world that offered him none. The dream of escape became a burning, terrifying necessity on one horrifying afternoon that would be seared into Eugene's memory forever. His father, Big Chief Ox, got into a heated dispute with his white foreman at the factory where he worked, a dispute over dignity and respect. The argument escalated, and later that day, a lynch mob came for him. Eugene, just a boy, watched in frozen terror as a mob of angry white men, their faces twisted with hate, descended on their small home. He hid, listening to the sickening sound of splintering wood as they broke down the door. The chorus of racial slurs, the raw, unhinged violence. He heard the sounds of the beating, the thuds of fists and clubs against his father's body. Miraculously, his father survived. He was left for dead, but he was not dead. He made his way back into the house, battered, bruised, but somehow, impossibly, unbroken. That night, looking at his father's swollen but defiant face, Eugene understood the fragility of his existence. The lesson was no longer abstract. His father's words echoed in his soul with the force of a final command. "Boy, you gotta get out of here. Run away. A black man ain't safe in this country." He ran. He was not yet a teenager. With nothing in his pockets but a few hoarded cents and the mythical name of a country an ocean away, he began an odyssey that would have broken most grown men. He was now a fugitive, not from the law, but from the culture itself. He wandered through Georgia, a small, lonely figure, against a vast, hostile landscape, searching for a path to his promised land. He learned to live on the margins, to read the intentions in a stranger's eyes, to sleep in fields and abandoned barns, always moving, always wary of the casual cruelty that could erupt at any moment. For a time, he fell in with a community of English Romani travelers, a group of fellow outsiders. In their wandering, nomadic life, he found a kindred spirit. They didn't see his color, they saw a boy in need, and for a while, he found a fragile sense of belonging. But the dream of France never faded. He knew his only chance was to reach the coast, to find a ship that could carry him across the water. He eventually made his way to the bustling port of Norfolk, Virginia, a chaotic city teeming with sailors and ships from every corner of the globe. The salty air was thick with the smells of coal, tar, and possibility. He saw his chance. In the dead of night, he snuck onto a German freighter, the Marta Russ, and hid himself in the suffocating darkness of the ship's hold. He was a stowaway, a boy without a name or a ticket, huddled amongst the cargo, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilarating hope. He had no idea where the ship was going. He only knew that it was going away. The first step on a journey that would carry him across an ocean and into the pages of history had been taken. The voyage across the Atlantic was a trial by darkness and fear. Huddled in the cavernous, rat-infested hold of the Marta Russ, Eugene Bullard existed in a state of suspended animation. He survived on stolen scraps of food and sips of brackish water, his world reduced to the groaning of the ship's timbers and the constant, rhythmic roll of the waves. Every footstep on the deck above was a potential discovery, every shout of the German crew a possible end to his dream. He had no way of tracking the passage of time, no idea if days or weeks had passed. He was a ghost in the belly of a steel beast, a boy caught between a past he had fled and a future he could only imagine. When the ship's engines finally fell silent and the sounds of a busy port filtered down into the darkness, he knew his journey was at an end, for better or worse. He was discovered, a dirty, emaciated boy, blinking in the unfamiliar light as the crew dragged him from his hiding place. But the fate he had feared, a brutal beating or being handed over to the authorities, did not come to pass. The German sailors, perhaps seeing the desperation and determination in his eyes, took a strange pity on him. Instead of punishment, they gave him a few shillings and pointed him toward the shore. He was in Aberdeen, Scotland. It was not France, but it was a new world. Stepping onto the cobbled streets of Aberdeen was like stepping onto another planet. For the first time in his life, Eugene was in a place where he was not defined by the color of his skin. He was a curiosity, yes. A young black boy in a Scottish port city was an unusual sight, and people stared. But the stares were different. They were not filled with the familiar, suffocating contempt he had known in Georgia. They were looks of simple curiosity, of surprise, maybe even a little wonder. He could walk into a shop and be served. He could walk down the middle of the sidewalk without fear. This simple, profound absence of hate was a revelation. It was the first breath of truly free air he had ever taken, and it was intoxicating. But Scotland was cold, and he was alone and penniless. He began to drift south, working his way through Great Britain, a restless soul in search of his promised land. He took any job he could find, a testament to his resilience and his will to survive. He worked as a docker in Liverpool, his young body hardened by the relentless labor of hauling cargo. He worked at an amusement park, a strange and vibrant world of lights and laughter. And it was in London that he found his first real calling. He discovered he had a talent for fighting. The world of amateur and semi-professional boxing in pre-war London was a rough, gritty subculture. In the smoky, crowded boxing halls of places like Liverpool and Bethnal Green, men from all walks of life came to test their mettle and earn a few pounds. For Eugene, it was a natural fit. He was quick, agile, and possessed a fighter's heart, forged in the crucible of his escape. He began to train, learning the craft, honing his skills. Boxing was a world of brutal honesty. Inside the ropes, your background didn't matter. Your accent didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was whether you could fight. And Eugene could fight. He became a popular attraction, billed as the exotic American fighter. He was a natural showman, his charisma and flashy style delighting the crowds. He was making a name for himself, carving out an identity not as a runaway, but as a contender. He traveled, fighting in exhibition matches across England. But the dream of Paris never left him. He saved his money, and in 1913, he finally bought a ticket for a ferry across the English Channel. When he arrived in Paris, he knew instantly that he was home. If London had been a breath of fresh air, Paris was a full-throated song of freedom. It was the city of light, a vibrant, chaotic, and beautiful metropolis that was, at that moment, the cultural capital of the world. It was a city teeming with artists, poets, revolutionaries, and dreamers from every corner of the globe, and it embraced him. He settled in Montmartre, the city's bohemian heart, a labyrinth of winding streets, artists' studios, and raucous nightclubs. He found work immediately, not just as a boxer, but as a performer in a vaudeville troupe called Freddie Bruce's Pickaninnies. The name was a cringe-worthy relic of American minstrelsy, but the work was a revelation. He slapped a bass drum. He learned to tap dance. He was part of the show. And at night, he immersed himself in the city's burgeoning jazz scene. Jazz was the sound of the new century, a raw, energetic, and soulful music that was just beginning to find a home in the smoky basement clubs of Paris. For Eugene, who had grown up surrounded by the spirituals and work songs of the South, it was a familiar language, a sound that spoke of both pain and joy, of struggle and liberation. He felt a sense of belonging he had never imagined possible. In the cafes and clubs of Paris, he was not judged. He was simply Eugene Bullard, an American artist, a boxer, a musician. He could sit at a table with painters from Spain, poets from Ireland, and revolutionaries from Russia, and be treated as an equal. He was living the life his father had described to him as a boy, a dusty shack in Georgia. He had found his paradise, a fragile, beautiful world he had traveled thousands of miles and endured incredible hardship to reach. But that paradise, that vibrant, beautiful world he had come to love, was living on borrowed time. Throughout the idyllic summer of 1914, as the cafes of Paris buzzed with art and conversation, the whispers of war grew into a roar. An archduke had been assassinated in a city most Parisians couldn't find on a map. Ancient treaties were being invoked. Empires were mobilizing their armies. The world was sliding, inexorably, toward a catastrophe. For Eugene Bullard, the boy who had run away from the hatred and violence of his own country, a terrible and profound irony was unfolding. He had finally found a country he was willing to fight and die for. and that country was about to call his bluff. The storm was coming, and the City of Light was about to be plunged into darkness. When the Great War erupted in August 1914, it ripped through Europe with the force of a tidal wave, pulling an entire generation of young men into its bloody undertow. For Eugene Bullard, this was not a distant conflict between kings and emperors. France, the nation that had finally given him a home and treated him with dignity, was under attack. He felt a profound sense of loyalty, a debt of honor that he believed could only be paid in service. On his 19th birthday, just a few weeks after the war began, Eugene Bullard walked into a recruitment office and did what thousands of other foreign volunteers were doing. He enlisted in the French Foreign Legion. The Legion was a legendary and fearsome fighting force, a melting pot of men from all over the world, adventurers, criminals, political exiles, and dreamers. It had a reputation for being sent into the most dangerous battles, a spearhead for the French army. The Legion's creed was its greatest appeal. It cared nothing for your past, your nationality, or the color of your skin. If you could fight, you were a legionnaire, a brother in arms. For the boy from Georgia who had spent his life being judged by his race, this was the ultimate meritocracy. He was joining not just an army, but an ideal. He was thrown into the meat grinder. The war that everyone thought would be over by Christmas had bogged down into a brutal, static stalemate. The Western Front was a festering wound stretching across the face of Europe, a hellish landscape of trenches, barbed wire, and shell craters. Bullard and his fellow legionnaires were sent into some of the war's earliest and most chaotic battles on the Somme and in Picardy. This was the raw, unfiltered horror of modern warfare. He learned to live in the mud, to sleep standing up in a waterlogged trench, to ignore the gnawing rats that were as numerous as the soldiers. He learned the terrifying new arithmetic of a war where human lives were spent like currency for a few yards of worthless ground. He saw men vaporized by direct artillery hits, cut in half by machine gun fire, choked to death by poison gas. He learned the grim art of trench raiding, of slipping into the darkness of no man's land with a knife and a handful of grenades. But even in this unimaginable hell, his spirit refused to be broken. He became a popular and respected soldier, known for his relentless good humor and his almost reckless courage. His comrades, a mix of men from dozens of different countries, saw in him not an American, not a black man, but simply Gene, a reliable soldier you'd want beside you when you went over the top. He fought through the bloody Second Battle of Artois and the Second Battle of Champagne, massive offensives that resulted in hundreds of thousands of casualties for little to no gain. He survived, but he was a part of a unit that was being systematically annihilated. Then, in early 1916, what was left of his Legion regiment was sent to the one place that would become the ultimate symbol of the war's feudal horror: Verdun. The Battle of Verdun was not just a battle, it was a 10-month-long apocalypse. The German strategy was simple and monstrous: to bleed the French army to death. They massed an unprecedented amount of artillery and began a bombardment so intense it literally changed the geography of the land, turning forests into splinters and hills into dust. The French, understanding that the loss of Verdun would be a catastrophic blow to national morale, committed to defending it at any cost. The result was the longest and one of the deadliest battles in human history, a vortex of steel and fire that consumed nearly 1 million men. In March of 1916, Bullard and his unit were holding a position on the front lines when a massive German assault began. They were caught in a hurricane of artillery fire. The world dissolved into a deafening, earth-shattering roar. An exploding shell tore through his position, and a piece of shrapnel ripped into his thigh, shattering the bone. He was thrown into the air, landing in the mud of a shell crater, his leg a ruin of blood and splintered bone. He lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness, convinced he was going to die. He was eventually found by stretcher bearers and evacuated, another piece of human wreckage in a battle that produced it on an industrial scale. His war as an infantryman was over. The wound was severe, and it would leave him with a permanent limp. As he lay recovering in a hospital in Lyon, surrounded by the ghosts of the men he had lost, France honored his sacrifice. He was awarded the Croix de Guerre with a star, one of the nation's highest military honors for bravery. The citation praised his courage and his service. He had paid his debt to France in blood. For most men, a wound that ended their frontline service would have been the end of their war. But Eugene Bullard was not most men. As he slowly recovered, he became fascinated by the new knights of the 20th century, the pilots. He would watch the fragile biplanes buzzing in the sky above the hospital, and a new, audacious dream began to form. He had fought in the mud. Now, he wanted to fight in the clouds. He heard about the Lafayette Escadrille, the glamorous squadron of American volunteer pilots who were fighting for France. They were daredevils, heroes whose exploits were celebrated in newspapers around the world. Bullard decided he would become one of them. The idea seemed insane. Aviation was a new, elite, and incredibly dangerous profession. It was seen as a gentleman's pursuit, reserved for the well-educated and well-connected. Bullard was a wounded infantryman, a former boxer, and a black man from the American South. But he was also a decorated hero of France, and he was relentlessly persistent. He petitioned, he argued, he used every ounce of his charm and the weight of his military record to make his case. A friend of his, a wealthy socialite, is said to have placed a bet with French officials that Bullard could become a pilot. Whatever the reason, in a stunning display of the French military's pragmatism, they agreed. In October 1916, the boy from Georgia was officially accepted into the Aéronautique Militaire for flight training. The next chapter of his impossible life was about to begin. The transition from the horizontal hell of the trenches to the vertical freedom of the sky was like a rebirth for Eugene Bullard. He was sent to flight school, a world away from the mud and the static lines of the front. Here, the challenge was not about enduring a bombardment, but about mastering a new and unforgiving technology. The airplanes of 1916 were not the sleek, powerful machines we imagine today. They were fragile contraptions of wood, canvas, and wire, held together by little more than hope and rudimentary engineering. The engines were notoriously unreliable, prone to catching fire or seizing up in midair. The controls were sluggish, the instruments were basic, and the very act of flying was a constant negotiation with the wind and the machine's own inherent instability. For the young men learning to fly them, death was a constant and intimate companion, not just in combat, but in training itself. Bullard, however, took to it with a natural grace that stunned his instructors. Perhaps it was the reflexes of a boxer, the innate sense of balance and timing. Or perhaps it was something deeper. For a man who had spent his entire life navigating a world of rigid boundaries and limitations, the three-dimensional freedom of the sky was a revelation. He loved the feeling of leaving the ground, of watching the scarred and broken landscape of France shrink below him. He later described the experience with a simple, profound clarity. Up there, you were truly free. No one could touch you. The whole world was yours. In the sky, there was no Jim Crow. There was only the pilot, the machine, and the vast, empty canvas of the air. He mastered the basics, learning to take off and land, to execute turns and stalls, to feel the aircraft as an extension of his own body. He was a quick study, and his passion was obvious to everyone. On May 5th, 1917, he officially received his pilot's wings, brevet number 6950. He had done it. The boy from Columbus, Georgia, who had been told the sky was not for him, was now a licensed military aviator. It was a personal triumph of unimaginable proportions. But history was unfolding with a cruel and ironic sense of timing. Just a month earlier, in April 1917, after years of neutrality, the United States had officially declared war on Germany. American doughboys were beginning to arrive in France, and with them came the institutionalized racism of the American military. Bullard, filled with a renewed and perhaps naive sense of patriotism, saw a chance to finally serve the country of his birth. He was a trained, experienced pilot. He was a decorated combat veteran of the French army. He was, by any objective measure, exactly the kind of asset the new and inexperienced United States Army Air Service desperately needed. He went to the American headquarters in Paris and officially applied to transfer from the French Aéronautique Militaire to the U.S. Army Air Service. He wanted to fly for America. He wanted to wear the uniform of his own country. The response was a swift and brutal slap in the face. He was rejected. Flatly. There was no discussion, no review of his qualifications. The reason was a single, unchangeable fact. He was black. The U.S. Army Air Service, like much of the American military, had a policy of strict racial exclusion. They did not accept Negro pilots. Period. The sting of that rejection was profound, a wound deeper than any shrapnel. He had proven his loyalty to the Allied cause. He had bled for it. He was a hero in France. But to his own country, he was still just a color. He was good enough to die in a trench for France, but not good enough to fly a plane for America. It was the same irrational, soul-crushing hatred he had run from as a boy. A poison that had somehow followed him across an ocean and found him in the midst of a war fought for freedom. The hypocrisy was staggering. America was sending its sons to Europe to make the world safe for democracy, while simultaneously denying its own black citizens the most basic forms of it. Heartbroken, but not broken, Bullard made a choice. He would continue to fight, but he would fight for the country that had accepted him. He returned to the French, who welcomed him back without question. He was assigned to the Escadrille SPA 93, a frontline fighter squadron, and then to Escadrille SPA 85. He joined an elite brotherhood of French and American volunteer pilots, the Knights of the Air, men who were becoming legends. He was given a state-of-the-art SPAD 7 biplane, one of the best fighters of its time, and it was on this aircraft that he made his famous defiant statement to the world. On the side of his fuselage, he painted a large, bleeding heart with a dagger plunging through it. Below it, he stenciled a motto that was both a personal creed and a direct challenge to the racism he had just encountered. Tout le sang coule rouge. All blood runs red. It was an elegant, powerful, and deeply subversive message. In a world tearing itself apart over imagined differences of race and nationality, Bullard was declaring a simple, biological truth. When you cut a man, he bleeds red, regardless of the color of his skin. On the tail, he painted his squadron's insignia, a charging rooster. He was now officially a chasseur, a hunter. His job was to fly over the front lines, to escort bombers, to conduct reconnaissance, and to engage and destroy German aircraft. In August of 1917, Eugene Bullard flew his first combat mission, and in the skies over France, he would finally earn the legend that history had destined for him. The German pilots, when they began to encounter this swift, aggressive pilot in a plane with a bleeding heart, had no idea who he was. They only knew he was a deadly and effective opponent. They would give him a name that perfectly captured the awe and fear he inspired: the Black Swallow of Death. The sky had become his battlefield, and he would fight in it with the fury of a man who had nothing left to prove and everything to defend. As the Black Swallow of Death, Eugene Bullard carved his name into the violent skies of the Western Front. His time as a fighter pilot was a brief, incandescent blaze of glory, a period of intense, life-or-death action that would define him forever. The Air War of 1917 was a brutal and personal form of combat. Unlike the anonymous slaughter in the trenches below, the fight in the sky was a duel, a one-on-one test of skill, nerve, and instinct. Pilots flew in flimsy machines that could be torn apart by a single burst of machine gun fire. They navigated by sight and feel, their faces chapped by the wind, their bodies numb from the cold at high altitudes. Every flight was a gamble, a flirtation with death in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the sky. Bullard flew over 20 combat missions, a significant number in an era where the life expectancy of a new pilot could be as low as 3 weeks. He plunged into the chaotic maelstrom of the dogfight, the swirling mass of Allied and German planes twisting and turning in a deadly dance. He learned the deadly geometry of aerial combat, how to use the sun to mask his approach, how to position his Spad to get a clean shot at an enemy's vulnerable tail, how to execute a dizzying snap roll or a life-saving split S-dive to escape an attacker. He was an aggressive and fearless pilot, known for diving headlong into a fight, even when outnumbered. His official combat record credits him with 2 confirmed victories. In one engagement, he shot down a German Fokker Dr. I, the same type of triplane flown by the infamous Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen. In another, he sent a German observation balloon, a key asset for directing artillery fire, plummeting to the earth in flames. He claimed several other unofficial victories, planes that he saw go down, but which crashed too far behind enemy lines to be officially verified by French observers on the ground. These claims were not boasts. They were the confident assessments of a man who knew his business. He flew as a wingman for some of France's most celebrated aces, including the legendary Charles Nungesser, a testament to the fact that among the pilots themselves in the crucible of combat, his skill was recognized and respected. He was a part of the elite fraternity of Knights of the Air, and in that brotherhood, the only color that mattered was the color of the roundels on your wings. His unique status as the only black pilot in a predominantly white Air Force made him a figure of fascination. French newspapers wrote glowing articles about l'hirondelle noire de l'amour, celebrating his exoticism and his courage. For a brief period, he was a celebrity, but his fame was a double-edged sword. He was an anomaly, a living challenge to the deeply ingrained racial hierarchies of the time, and not everyone in the Allied command was comfortable with it. The prejudice he had encountered from the American military establishment was a persistent, toxic presence, even on French airfields. As American officers and personnel began to arrive in France in greater numbers, Bullard found himself increasingly subjected to the very racism he had fled. There are numerous accounts of American officers being openly hostile and disrespectful to him, refusing to salute a black man, even one wearing the uniform and rank of a French NCO. They saw his status as a pilot not as an achievement, but as an aberration, an affront to the natural order of things. For Bullard, who had found a measure of equality in the French army, this reintroduction to the poison of American-style racism was a source of constant friction and frustration. He was a hero to the French, but to many of his own countrymen, he was still just a target for their contempt. The incident that ultimately and tragically ended his flying career was a direct result of this simmering racial tension. In November 1917, after an off-duty dispute with a French officer, Bullard was brought up on charges. The exact details of the altercation are murky and have been debated by historians for decades. Some accounts say it was a simple brawl, but Bullard's own version, and the one supported by much of the circumstantial evidence, is that the argument was instigated by American personnel who were harassing him with racial slurs. When the French officer intervened, not to defend Bullard, but to assert his own authority, a physical confrontation ensued. Regardless of the cause, the result was a catastrophe for Bullard. He was a black American volunteer in a French uniform who had gotten into a fight with a white French officer. In the rigid hierarchy of the military, there was only one way this could end. He was found guilty of insubordination. He was disciplined, and in a decision that was both disproportionately harsh and deeply unjust, he was removed from the French air service. It was a devastating, career-ending blow. The sky, his ultimate refuge, the one place where he had found true freedom and equality, had been taken from him. It was a bitter, cruel reminder that no matter how many medals he won, no matter how many Germans he shot down, the color of his skin could still be used as a weapon to ground him. He wasn't kicked out of the army. In a final, almost insulting twist, he was transferred back to the infantry. He was assigned to the 170th French Infantry Regiment, the same unit he had served with in the Foreign Legion before his first wounding at Verdun. He finished the war exactly where he had started it, in the cold, wet, soul-destroying mud of the trenches. He served out the remaining year of the war with his characteristic discipline, but the fire had been dimmed. He fought until the armistice was signed on November 11th, 1918. He had served the Allied cause for 4 years, been wounded twice, been decorated with the highest honors of the French army, and had made history. When the war ended, he was a celebrated hero in his adopted country. But the country of his birth had already begun the process of erasing him. While America was preparing massive parades for its returning white heroes, including the celebrated white pilots of the Lafayette Escadrille, with whom Bullard had often flown, his name was conspicuously absent from the narrative. He was the forgotten ace, the inconvenient hero whose story did not fit the racially segregated script that America wanted to write about the Great War. The black swallow of death had been rendered invisible. As the guns fell silent and a scarred and traumatized Europe began to pick up the pieces, Eugene Bullard stood at a crossroads. He was a decorated hero of France, a man who had given 4 years of his life and shed his blood for his adopted country. But the country of his birth, America, still had no place for him. While other American veterans, including the white pilots he had flown alongside, were returning home to ticker-tape parades and national acclaim, Bullard knew that a return to the United States meant a return to the suffocating confines of Jim Crow. The thought of going back to a world of whites-only signs and the constant threat of racial violence was unbearable. He had tasted freedom, equality, and respect in Paris, and he could not bring himself to leave it. He chose to stay. He chose France. And as the world stumbled out of the shadow of war and into the giddy, chaotic, and revolutionary era of the Roaring Twenties, Eugene Bullard reinvented himself once again. The warrior became an artist, an entrepreneur, and a central figure in the cultural explosion that was transforming Paris. This was the era of the lost generation, a time when Paris was a magnet for artists, writers, musicians, and intellectuals from all over the world, all seeking to create something new out of the ashes of the old world. And at the heart of this cultural ferment was a new, electrifying sound that was taking the city by storm: American jazz. Bullard, with his natural charisma, his American roots, and his war hero status, was perfectly positioned to ride this wave. He decided to open a nightclub. He found a small venue in the heart of Montmartre, the city's bohemian quarter, and in 1924, he opened Le Grand Duc. It was an almost immediate sensation. Bullard was a natural host. He moved through the crowded, smoke-filled room with an easy grace, greeting aristocrats, artists, and tourists with the same warm smile. He had a pet monkey named Jimmy, which he famously dressed in custom-made tuxedos, a touch of whimsical showmanship that delighted his patrons. His club was not just a bar, it was a destination, a cultural hub. Le Grand Duc became the unofficial headquarters for the community of Black American expatriates who were flocking to Paris, seeking the artistic and social freedom they were denied at home. On any given night, a young Langston Hughes might be found in a corner, scribbling poetry on a napkin. The legendary trumpeter Louis Armstrong, when he was in town, would often stop by for an impromptu jam session. Bullard hired the best talent, most famously the brilliant singer Ada Bricktop Smith, whose performances at his club would make her a Parisian legend in her own right. He didn't just play jazz, he curated it, helping to introduce the authentic sounds of Black America to a European audience that was hungry for its raw, soulful energy. His club also became a favorite haunt for the literary and artistic giants of the era. Ernest Hemingway was a regular at the bar, as were F. Scott Fitzgerald, and a host of other writers and painters. They were drawn not just by the music, but by Bullard himself. He was a living legend, a man with 1,000 stories, and they loved to listen. He could talk about dogfights over Verdun one minute and the intricacies of the Parisian boxing scene the next. He was a bridge between worlds, between the grit of the battlefield and the glamour of the cabaret. He became a successful and wealthy businessman. He eventually opened a second, larger nightclub, L'Escadrille, a nod to his past as a pilot. He also owned an athletic club, capitalizing on his fame as a boxer. He had achieved a level of success, wealth, and social acceptance that would have been utterly, laughably impossible for a black man in the United States. He married into the French aristocracy, wedding Marcelle Straumann, a countess with whom he had 2 daughters, Jacqueline and Lolita. He had gone from a penniless runaway hiding in the hold of a ship to a Parisian king, a self-made man who had conquered not just the sky, but the very heights of European society. He was living the dream his father had whispered to him as a boy in a dusty shack in Georgia. But the shadows of history were gathering on the horizon once again. As the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, the joyous energy of the Jazz Age began to fade, replaced by the grim reality of the Great Depression and the rise of a new, sinister political force in Germany. Bullard, who was fluent in German from his time on the freighter and his travels, began to notice a change in the clientele at his clubs. The German tourists and businessmen who had always been a part of the Parisian scene were different now. They were louder, more arrogant, and they spoke with a disturbing enthusiasm about their new leader, Adolf Hitler, and his vision for a new German empire. Bullard listened. His experiences had given him a keen instinct for danger and a deep personal hatred for the kind of racial ideology the Nazis espoused. He saw in their rhetoric the same poison of racial supremacy that he had fled in the American South, just repackaged with a different accent. He knew he had to do something. His loyalty to France was absolute. His unique position as a popular nightclub owner, who was seen as just a charming entertainer, made him the perfect, invisible observer. He was approached by agents of French counterintelligence, the Deuxième Bureau, who recognized his potential. They asked him to become an informant, a spy in the fight against the growing Nazi threat. Bullard agreed without hesitation. The former fighter pilot was about to enter a new, secret war, a war of whispers, secrets, and shadows fought in the smoky, champagne-soaked backrooms of his own clubs. Once again, he weaponized the prejudice of his enemies against them. The Nazi agents and sympathizers who frequented his clubs saw him as a harmless black man, an entertainer, a servant. They spoke freely in front of him, convinced that he either couldn't understand their German, or that what he heard was of no consequence. They underestimated him, and that was their fatal mistake. Bullard listened intently. He charmed them, poured their drinks, and remembered everything: names, dates, conversations about military buildups, political plans, and the identities of other spies. He passed this vital information on to his French handlers. He was on the front lines of the fight against fascism years before the rest of the world was willing to admit a war was even coming. But this secret war of espionage was about to become a very real and very public one. When Hitler's armies finally crossed the border and the sound of German tanks echoed on the roads to Paris, Eugene Bullard, now in his mid-40s and a father of 2, did something that defied all logic and expectation. He volunteered to fight again. The warrior was not done yet. When the Blitzkrieg tore through the French defenses in the spring of 1940, it was the death knell for the world Eugene Bullard had so carefully built. The vibrant, free-spirited Paris that had been his home for nearly 3 decades was about to be swallowed by the Third Reich. For Bullard, this was not just the fall of a city, it was an existential threat. The Nazi ideology was a twisted, more monstrous version of the very white supremacy he had fled in Georgia. As a black man, a known associate of the French resistance, and a spy who had been actively working against them, he knew that capture by the Gestapo would not mean a prisoner of war camp. It would mean torture and a brutal, anonymous death. He was 45 years old, a successful businessman, a father, and a man whose body was already scarred by a previous war. He had a permanent limp from the shrapnel at Verdun. He had every reason to flee, to gather his daughters and his fortune and escape to the safety of a neutral country. But Bullard's loyalty to France was absolute, a bond forged in the trenches and the sky. He could not bring himself to abandon his adopted country in its darkest hour. Instead, he made a decision that was as brave as it was seemingly irrational. He chose to stay and fight. He entrusted his 2 young daughters to the care of friends and made his way to the front lines. He couldn't join the regular army, but he found a place with a volunteer unit, the 51st Infantry Regiment, which was desperately trying to defend the city of Orléans from the relentless German advance. This was not the patriotic, organized army of 1914. This was a military in a state of chaotic collapse, a desperate collection of regular soldiers, old men, and teenagers fighting a hopeless rearguard action against the unstoppable German panzer divisions. Bullard, the middle-aged man with a bad leg, found himself once again in a foxhole with a rifle in his hand. The fighting was brutal and chaotic. During a fierce firefight with an advancing German infantry unit, his position was targeted by mortar fire. The world exploded in a shower of dirt and steel. Bullard was hit. A shell fragment tore into his back, a deep and agonizing wound. He was evacuated from the front lines, another casualty in a war that France was rapidly losing. The French government was collapsing, and the army was in full retreat. It was clear that the battle for France was over. Wounded and now a fugitive in a country that was being occupied by his sworn enemies, Bullard knew he had to escape. As a known anti-Nazi agitator whose activities had been monitored, his name was likely on a Gestapo list. He made his way south, a painful and perilous journey through a country in chaos. With the help of friends in the French resistance and a sympathetic official at the American consulate, he and his daughters managed to secure passage out of the country. They traveled through the treacherous terrain of the Pyrenees Mountains into neutral Spain, and from there, they boarded a ship bound for the United States. In July 1940, Eugene Bullard, the decorated hero of France, the jazz-age impresario, the spy, stepped onto American soil in New York City for the first time in over 30 years. He was returning not as a celebrated hero, but as a wounded refugee. His nightclubs, his fortune, his Parisian life, all of it had been lost to the war. His future was a complete and terrifying unknown. He was coming home to a country he barely recognized, and a country that had never truly recognized him. The America he returned to was, in many ways, the same one he had fled as a boy. It was a nation on the brink of its own entry into the war, but it was still a nation deeply and rigidly segregated. The casual and systemic racism he had hoped to leave behind forever was the first thing to greet him. He was a stranger in his own land, a man whose incredible life story was an incomprehensible anomaly. His French military honors, his historic status as the world's first black combat pilot, meant absolutely nothing here. In the eyes of 1940s America, his accomplishments were invisible. He was just another black man, and he was expected to know his place. He settled in Harlem, the vibrant heart of Black America. But he was not the returning hero he should have been. The Harlem Renaissance he had helped to inspire from his Parisian clubs had largely faded, replaced by the harsh realities of the Great Depression and the looming threat of another world war. He was an outsider, a man with a French accent, a slight limp, and a lifetime of experiences that were almost impossible to communicate to those around him. He tried to find work, but his war injuries, particularly the new wound in his back, made manual labor difficult. The glamorous, high-flying life of Paris was a distant, painful memory. His life became a series of humble, anonymous jobs. He sold perfume at a department store. He worked as a security guard. He even took a job unloading cargo on the docks, his body aching from the strain. The man who had been celebrated in Paris was now invisible in New York. He was a hero, living in the shadows, his incredible story locked away behind a quiet and dignified exterior, a story he rarely told because so few were willing or able to believe it. He watched from the sidelines as America finally entered World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor. He saw the hypocrisy play out all over again on an even grander scale as the nation called upon its black citizens to fight for the 4 freedoms abroad while denying them those same freedoms at home. He saw the creation of the Tuskegee Airmen, the next generation of black pilots who would have to fight the same battles for respect and recognition that he had fought a generation earlier. He was a living testament to their struggle, a pioneer they likely didn't even know existed. He tried to tell his story, to offer his experience, but in the whirlwind of a new war, he was a relic from an old one, a hero whose legend had been written in a language most Americans had forgotten or never bothered to learn in the first place. The black swallow of death had been grounded, not by an enemy plane, but by the relentless, soul-crushing gravity of American prejudice. And his final, most heartbreaking confrontation with that prejudice was yet to come. The end of World War II brought a wave of triumph and relief to America, but for Eugene Bullard, it only served to sharpen the painful ironies of his life. He watched as a new generation of veterans, both black and white, returned from Europe and the Pacific. He saw the GI Bill begin to reshape American society, offering educational opportunities and housing loans that would create a new middle class. But these opportunities were largely denied to black veterans, who returned from fighting global fascism to face the same old racism at home. For Bullard, who had now fought in 2 world wars for the cause of democracy, this cynical pattern was a source of profound and quiet disillusionment. Perhaps the most heartbreaking and symbolic moment of his post-war life, the incident that crystallized the entirety of his American experience, came on a late summer day in 1949. A concert was being held in Peekskill, New York, featuring the world-renowned singer, actor, and activist Paul Robeson. Robeson was a towering figure, a brilliant artist who had become one of the most outspoken and powerful critics of American racism. Because of his activism and his sympathies for the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War, he had become a primary target for anti-communist and white supremacist groups. The concert was a flashpoint for this tension. A violent mob composed of local residents, members of the KKK, and veterans groups inflamed by anti-communist hysteria gathered to protest. They surrounded the concert grounds, armed with rocks, bats, and racist epithets. Eugene Bullard, now in his 50s and living a quiet life in New York, was at that concert. He had come not as a political agitator, but simply to hear a great artist and stand in solidarity. As the concert ended and the attendees tried to leave, the mob attacked. It was a full-blown riot. Cars were overturned, windows were smashed, and people were dragged out and brutally beaten. The police response was a study in institutional betrayal. Instead of protecting the concert-goers, they either stood by and watched, or, in some cases, actively joined in the assault. Bullard, seeing a man being savagely beaten by a group of attackers, did what he had always done. He stepped in to help. He was immediately set upon. He was brutally attacked, beaten to the ground by a state trooper and several members of the mob. The man who had faced German machine guns at Verdun, who had dogfought in the skies of France, who had spied on Nazis in Paris, and who had been wounded in the defense of democracy in 2 world wars, was now lying bleeding on American soil, beaten by the very people and institutions he had dedicated his life to protecting. He was filmed, a stoic but battered figure, being clubbed by a police officer, an image that briefly flashed across the newsreels. But the incident, like so much of his life, was quickly swept under the rug of American public consciousness. The attack left him with permanent injuries, including damage to one of his eyes. But the deeper wound was to his spirit. The last vestiges of his faith in the American promise of equality seemed to die that day in the mud and blood of Peekskill. How could he reconcile the hero's welcome he had received in France with the brutal reality of being assaulted by a uniformed officer in his own country for the crime of attending a concert? He retreated further into obscurity, spending his final years living alone in a small, sparsely furnished apartment in New York City. He found his last and most famous job, an elevator operator at Rockefeller Center. It was a quiet, anonymous existence. Every day, he would put on his uniform, a different kind of uniform now, and ferry the titans of industry, the celebrities, and the tourists up and down the iconic building. The irony was almost too heavy to bear. The man who had soared in the sky was now confined to a small, moving box. But even in this diminished role, he maintained his dignity. He was known for his professionalism and his quiet, courtly manner. And sometimes, a curious visitor would see the collection of medals pinned to the inside of his operator's jacket. He wore them not for show, but for himself, a private reminder of the life he had lived. There were 15 of them in total, including the Croix de Guerre and the Médaille Militaire, France's highest honors. When someone would ask about them, the quiet elevator operator would, for a few moments, become a hero again. The stories would pour out, of dogfights over Verdun, of jazz clubs in the heart of Paris, of narrow escapes from the Nazis. For a brief, fleeting moment, his captive audience in the elevator would get a glimpse of one of the 20th century's most incredible lives, a brief flicker of his former glory, illuminating the quiet solitude of his present. The final bittersweet chapter of his public life came in 1954. The French government, preparing a ceremony to relight the eternal flame at the tomb of the unknown soldier beneath the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, was searching for 3 of its most decorated and symbolic war heroes to perform the honor. They went through their archives, and they found the name of the American pilot, the Black Swallow of Death. They tracked him down to his small apartment in New York. Eugene Bullard was flown to Paris as a guest of the French Republic. He was put up in a grand hotel on the Champs-Élysées. He was once again treated like the national hero he was. He was given the place of honor at the ceremony, a Knight of the Legion of Honor, standing shoulder to shoulder with 2 white French generals. As he stood there, his chest glittering with the medals that his adopted country had bestowed upon him, and helped to relight the flame that symbolized France's undying gratitude to its soldiers, it must have felt like a dream. For a few days, he was a celebrity again. The French press hailed him as a living legend. He was home. Then, he flew back to New York. He put his medals away. He put his uniform back on. And he returned to his job operating an elevator. The contrast was almost too cruel, too perfectly symbolic to be believed. A hero in France, an invisible man in America. That was the story of his life, a life lived in the painful, unbridgeable chasm between 2 worlds. The man who had flown so high was destined to finish his journey in a small, quiet box, going up and down, but ultimately going nowhere. The final years of Eugene Bullard's life were a quiet study in contrasts, a poignant epilogue to a life lived at full throttle. To the thousands of people who rushed past him in the lobby of Rockefeller Center, he was an invisible man, a uniformed functionary who pushed buttons and announced floors with a formal, slightly foreign accent. But in the solitude of his small apartment, he was the keeper of an extraordinary history. A man whose memories spanned continents, wars, and entire cultural movements. The crushing irony of his situation was not lost on him. He had hobnobbed with European royalty, befriended literary giants like Hemingway, fought in the skies against the pioneers of aerial combat, and spied on the architects of the Third Reich. Now, his daily reality was the gentle hum of an elevator cable and the fleeting, anonymous interactions with people who had no idea they were in the presence of a hero. There were, however, small, precious glimmers of recognition that broke through the thick fog of obscurity. In 1959, his incredible story caught the attention of Dave Garroway, the host of NBC's popular Today Show. Garroway was fascinated by this man, who was a living embodiment of so much forgotten 20th century history. He invited Bullard to be a guest on the show. For a few unforgettable minutes, on a national television broadcast, Eugene Bullard, dressed in his elevator operator's uniform, with his 15 French war medals pinned proudly to it, was given a chance to tell a fraction of his story. He spoke with a quiet, unshakable dignity about his service in the Foreign Legion, his time as the Black Swallow of Death, his glamorous life in Paris. The American public, for the first time, got a brief, shocking glimpse of the incredible life this man had lived. The segment was a sensation. Letters and donations poured into the studio from a stunned and moved audience. The management at Rockefeller Center, perhaps shamed by the national revelation that they had a war hero of this stature operating their elevators, put a plaque up in the lobby honoring his service. For a fleeting moment, America seemed to see him, but these moments were rare exceptions in a life that had become defined by solitude. His daughters had grown up and built their own lives in France. He lived alone, his health steadily failing from the accumulation of old war wounds and the permanent injuries he had sustained at the hands of the mob and police in Peekskill. In 1961, just 2 years after his brief moment of television fame, Eugene Bullard died of stomach cancer. He was 66 years old. His death went largely unnoticed by the country he had been born in. There was a small, perfunctory obituary in the New York Times, a brief acknowledgement of the passing of a man who had been the first Negro combat aviator. He was buried with full military honors, not from the United States, but from France. At his funeral in the French veterans section of a cemetery in Queens, New York, representatives of the French government were there to pay their respects. A French honor guard draped the tricolore, the flag he had fought and bled for, over his coffin. The final salute he received was from the country that had adopted him, not the one that had given him birth. It was a fitting, if profoundly heartbreaking, end to a life lived in the painful chasm between two worlds. For decades after his death, his story remained a well-kept secret, a footnote in history books, a piece of trivia known only to a handful of dedicated aviation enthusiasts and military historians. The great sweeping narrative of American heroism had no room for a man like Eugene Bullard. His story was too complex, too international, too uncomfortable. It was a story that challenged the simple, sanitized myths the nation preferred to tell itself. It was the story of a man who had to leave America to find equality, who fought for another country because his own wouldn't let him, and who was ultimately welcomed as a hero everywhere except his own home. It was an indictment, and nations are rarely eager to celebrate their own indictments. The fight for his legacy was a slow, quiet, and persistent one. It was carried on by historians who pieced together his life from dusty French military archives, old Parisian newspapers, and the few interviews he had given. It was championed by a new generation of black aviators and military officers, men and women who saw in Bullard a forgotten pioneer, a spiritual ancestor whose trail they were now following. They fought to have his contributions officially recognized, to have his name restored to its rightful place in the annals of American history. The ultimate posthumous vindication came on August the 23rd, 1994, 77 years after the U.S. Army had flatly rejected his application to fly. In a formal ceremony at the Pentagon, the United States Air Force officially commissioned Eugene Jacques Bullard as a second lieutenant. It was a profound act of historical correction, a symbolic gesture meant to right a deep and long-standing wrong. The boy from Georgia, who had been told he didn't belong in the sky, was finally, officially, an American military pilot. So, what is the final, enduring lesson of Eugene Bullard's extraordinary life? It is a story about the relentless, almost defiant pursuit of a dream in the face of impossible odds. It is a testament to the fact that talent, courage, and dignity are not confined by the artificial boundaries of race or nationality. Bullard was a man who simply refused to be defined by the limitations that others tried to place on him. When Georgia told him he was less than a man, he went to a place that would treat him as one. When America told him he couldn't fly, he flew for France. He lived his life as a true citizen of the world, his loyalties given not to a flag of convenience, but to the universal ideals of liberty and equality. His story is also a powerful and uncomfortable mirror held up to America itself. It reveals the profound, tragic wastefulness of prejudice, the talent that was squandered, the heroes that were ignored, all because of a hateful and irrational system of racial hierarchy. How many other Eugene Bullards were there? How many brilliant, courageous men and women were denied the chance to make their mark on the world simply because of the color of their skin? Bullard's story is exceptional, not just because of what he achieved, but because he managed to achieve it at all. He had to circumnavigate the entire globe and the entirety of American racism just to find a stage worthy of his talents. He is a hero of a different kind. Not a flawless saint, but a complex, charismatic, and deeply human figure who lived life on his own terms. He was a warrior, but he was also a bon vivant who loved jazz and champagne. He was a spy, but he was also a doting father. He was a man who experienced the very worst of humanity: lynch mobs, trench warfare, Nazi ideology, and yet never seemed to lose his fundamental optimism, his belief in the possibility of a better world. They said a black boy from Georgia had no business dreaming of the sky. He responded by becoming the world's first black fighter pilot. They tried to erase him from the history books. He has become an immortal legend, a permanent hero in the story of two nations. The story of Eugene Bullard is not just a story of black history, or French history, or even American history. It is a human story. A story about the enduring power of a single individual to defy a world of hate, and in the process, to craft a life of impossible adventure, profound principle, and everlasting honor. His final resting place may be in a quiet cemetery in Queens, but his spirit, the black swallow of death, will forever soar free.